You know what's crazy? When you finally leave after months or even years of feeling undervalued, of questioning whether you're asking for too much or expecting too little, something shifts in the air. And suddenly he's shocked that you actually did it, that you walked away. But here's the thing, your value was always there. It was never about him not knowing your worth. It was about him not believing you'd ever enforce it. So often we get caught in this cycle of thinking, if I just communicate more clearly, if I just give it a little more time, maybe he'll get it. We talk, we explain, we try to be patient. And sometimes, without realizing it, we start tolerating things we once said we'd never accept. Not because we don't believe we deserve better, but because we hope. We hope that love will be enough, that if he sees how much we care, he'll rise to meet us. But what actually happens is that the longer we stay without real change, the more we train someone to believe we're not going anywhere. We accidentally teach them that they can ignore the discomfort, delay the effort, and still have access to us. We don't mean to send that message, but every time we let something slide, every time we say it's fine when it's not, every time we show up, even when they don't meet us halfway, we reinforce the idea that our boundaries are flexible. That's why when you finally walk, it feels like a lightning bolt, because up until that moment, he never truly believed you would. He thought you'd always give one more chance. He thought your love would keep overriding your limits. But love isn't supposed to mean the abandonment of self. And when you finally chose to leave, not in anger, not in drama, but in quiet, grounded certainty, you did the one thing he didn't expect. You followed through. And let me tell you something. There is nothing more powerful than following through. That's not about playing games. It's not about being cold or teaching someone a lesson. It's about showing through action what your self-worth looks like in practice. You're not just saying, this isn't enough for me. You're showing it. You're backing your words with movement. And that's when it clicks. Because here's the reality. Most people don't change from comfort. They change from contrast, from loss, from that sudden jarring realization that you meant what you said, that they misjudged your patience as passivity, and that the thing they thought they could keep on pause has now moved on without them. And you know what's wild? That moment when you walk away is often the first time they actually see you clearly. It's the first time they recognize just how much they had, because now they don't. Before, they saw the version of you that was trying, that was hoping, that was holding space for them to grow. And it's not that you were weak for doing that. You were loving, you were invested. But once you stop trying, they suddenly see everything they took for granted. They see the consistency, the effort, the loyalty, the way you bent to understand them, the way you believed in who they could be, even when they weren't showing it. And now all of that is gone. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring enough about yourself to let go. And here's the truth that stings a little. They could have chosen you at any point. They could have stepped up. They could have matched your energy, but they didn't. Not because you weren't enough, but because they thought you'd never leave. That's the part that gets overlooked. It's not that they didn't know your value. It's that they assumed they could ignore it without consequences. But value isn't just about what you bring. It's about what you demand. Not in a selfish way, not in a controlling way, but in the quiet confidence that says, if you want access to my heart, I expect to feel emotionally safe here. I expect to feel seen. I expect to be treated like I matter. And if that's not happening, I have the courage to walk away, no matter how much I care. That's the difference between someone who talks about standards and someone who lives by them. And when you start living by them, people take notice, sometimes a little too late. But that's not your burden to carry. That's not your cue to rush back the second they panic. You left because something was missing for too long. You left because you finally believed in your own value more than their potential. You left because staying would have meant betraying yourself. And now he's left with the echo of your absence, realizing that what he thought would always be there isn't. You didn't leave to make a point. You left because you were the point. It's easy to stay. It's easy to keep telling yourself that maybe, just maybe, if you give it a little more time, if you're a little more patient, if you love a little harder, things will change. That he'll finally see your worth, that he'll start treating you the way you deserve, that somehow, someday, he'll wake up and realize what he has before he loses it. But let's be honest, most of the time, when someone thinks you'll never leave, it's not because they're evil or cruel. It's because history has taught them that you won't. Every time you forgave without change, every time you swallowed your feelings to avoid conflict, every time you chose to stay, even though you were hurting, it built a pattern. And people come to believe in patterns more than promises. So when you finally left, it shook him, not because he didn't know he was risking something, but because he never thought you'd actually do it. And that moment, that exact moment when you walked away, is when the power dynamic shifted. That's when he realized that love isn't enough if it's not matched, if it's not reciprocated, if it's not respected. And here's the truth that so many people struggle with. Leaving is not weakness. It is strength. The kind of strength that takes every ounce of courage you've got. Because leaving doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care deeply. Just not more than you care about your peace, your dignity, your self-respect. Staying would have been the easier option. You knew what to expect. You knew the rhythm, even if it wasn't healthy. There was comfort in the chaos, familiarity in the disappointment. You understood the version of love that made you anxious, made you overthink, made you question your worth, and because of that familiarity, you told yourself it was safer than the unknown. But the problem is, if you stay in something that constantly makes you question yourself, you start losing pieces of who you are, slowly, quietly, without even realizing it. You start shrinking to fit into someone else's world. You start compromising on things that matter, telling yourself it's just temporary, that it's what love demands. And then one day, you look in the mirror and you barely recognize the version of yourself that's still trying to hold it all together. That's why leaving isn't weakness. It's the exact opposite. It's facing the fear of loneliness and choosing truth anyway. It's walking into the unknown and trusting that peace is better than pretending. It's realizing that your value doesn't depend on whether someone finally sees it. It's always been there, always. And you get to decide whether someone's behavior aligns with it or not. You see, the hardest part isn't saying goodbye to him. It's saying goodbye to the hope you kept alive for so long. That maybe one day he'd step up, that he'd finally get it, that all your effort would pay off. But hope can keep you stuck just as easily as fear can. And at some point, you have to stop romanticizing potential and start honoring reality. You leaving wasn't just a decision, it was a declaration. A declaration that you're done settling, that you're done waiting for someone to meet you at your level, that love, to be real, must come with effort, presence, and consistency. And yes, when you left, he felt it. He felt the absence of your warmth, your loyalty, your belief in him, because deep down, he was leaning on that belief. He knew you'd always pick him, even when he didn't pick you. That's why it hit him so hard when you didn't come back this time. But this isn't about him anymore. It's about the version of you that finally said, enough. The version that refused to keep auditioning for a role you already earned. The version that no longer equates love with the version that doesn't fear walking away, because walking away from what's hurting you is an act of deep personal love. And no, it doesn't mean you stop loving him. It just means you finally started loving yourself more. When someone believes you'll never leave, they stop trying. It's not because they're evil or they don't. It's because over time they've learned there are no real consequences to their actions. You'll be upset, you'll express your pain, maybe you'll even threaten to walk away, but deep down they believe you won't actually go anywhere. And when that belief settles in, something subtle but dangerous begins to happen. They stop showing up with their best. They stop investing in the relationship like they did in the beginning. Because why would they? The fear of loss isn't there. When you finally leave, for real, it shocks the system. It's like the floor they were standing on suddenly disappears. They finally understand what your presence meant because they no longer have access to it. The things they took for granted, your affection, your attention, your emotional availability, it's gone. And now they're left with the reality they never prepared for because they never truly believed they'd have to face it. Up until that moment, they thought they had more time, more chances, more passes. And the truth is, you probably gave them those things. You gave grace, you gave understanding, you gave second and third and 10th chances. Not because you were weak, but because you were hoping they'd rise to meet you, hoping that the potential you saw would finally become the reality. But instead, what they learned was that the cost of mistreating you was nothing. So, when you finally walked away, you didn't just create distance, you taught them a lesson, a real one. Not a lesson born from drama or manipulation, but from consequence. They learned that someone's presence, your presence, is a privilege. When that privilege is abused, it can disappear. That's something they probably never considered because people get used to patterns. They get used to knowing how far they can push, how much they can neglect, how often they can let you down and still keep you. But the moment you leave, that story ends. They don't get to keep rewriting it. That's when the realization hits them. The calls start coming. The messages start pouring in. Suddenly they want to talk. Suddenly they understand. But here's the hardest truth. They don't miss you. They miss access to you. And it's not that they're lying or pretending. It's that they didn't value the connection while it was there. They want it now because the absence made them feel something. But what they're feeling isn't necessarily love, it's loss, it's discomfort, it's a bruised ego. It's the panic that comes when something they assumed was guaranteed is now gone. You see, consequence is one of life's greatest teachers. It speaks louder than words. When you begged them to show up, when you cried, when you explained over and over how you felt, that was information. But when you left, that was transformation. That's what creates a shift, because suddenly they're forced to look in the mirror and ask themselves, what did I do to lose something that was so loyal to me? And maybe they start making changes, maybe they start reflecting. But that's not the point of your exit. You didn't leave to change them. You left to save yourself. You left because you finally saw that being available to someone who doesn't honor you is a slow form of self-abandonment. You left because you realized your love deserves a container that can actually hold it, not one that leaks every time you try to pour into it. When you walk away, you shift the dynamic. You go from someone who's trying to be chosen to someone who's choosing. You reclaim your agency. And for the first time, they realize you were never a given, you were a gift they failed to cherish. The beauty of that moment, the heartbreak and the power of it, is that you didn't need them to understand in order to do what's best for you. Whether or not they finally get it is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to yourself, to your peace, to your future, to the version of you that spent far too long waiting to be seen. And now that version finally gets to breathe. Let them learn what they need to learn, but don't go back just because they're finally scared. Fear and love are not the same thing. Regret isn't a promise of change. It's just the shadow that follows when someone realizes the door has actually closed. And the truth is, sometimes the best thing you can teach someone is what it feels like to lose you. Sometimes we don't realize it, But we train people how to treat us, not with our words, but with what we tolerate, with what we accept, with the moments we give someone a pass, not because we're okay with how they acted, but because we're afraid that setting a boundary will drive them away. You might have said countless times, "I won't be treated like this," or "this isn't okay." But if the action that followed those words was always forgiveness, always another chance, always staying, then over time, what he learned wasn't what you were saying. What he learned was, you'll stay anyway. And look, I get it. It's not weakness. It's not that you didn't know what you deserved. It's that you hoped. You hoped he'd finally see it. You thought, if I just love harder, if I'm more patient, if I show him what loyalty looks like, maybe that will be enough for him to show up the way I need. But hope without evidence becomes a trap, a loop, and eventually we lose track of the number of times we told ourselves, just one more chance, just one more conversation, just one more time explaining how I feel. And meanwhile, what's happening on his end? He's becoming more certain that no matter what he does or doesn't do, you're not going anywhere. He doesn't consciously think of it as taking you for granted. It's more subtle than that. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing he doesn't really have to change, because deep down, you'll still be there. It's human nature. When someone always stays, we start to believe and that's the danger. Not of loving someone, but of loving them at your own expense. And then one day, you don't stay. You actually walk away. And it hits him like a freight train, not just because you're gone, but because it didn't fit the story he built in his head. You always stayed before. You always forgave. You always gave him time, gave him space, gave him your heart, even when he didn't fully appreciate it. He didn't believe you'd leave because you taught him you'd stay, not by choice, but by repetition. That's the shift. That's the turning point that often stings the most, not just for him, but for you too. Because it means recognizing how many times you bent yourself to keep something alive that was always slowly dying. You gave the benefit of the doubt again and again. You made excuses for the lack of effort. You softened your own needs so you wouldn't seem too much. And each time you did that, he became a little more certain that you were fine with things as they were. But the truth is, you weren't fine. You were just holding on. You were hoping he'd get there. You were waiting for him to wake up. And when he didn't, when the silence grew louder than the connection, you stopped talking. You stopped chasing. You stopped begging someone to realize your worth. You stopped trying to teach someone how to love you, because that's what it was, a teaching job, constantly showing someone how to show up for you. That's not love. That's labor. And love, real love, doesn't require constant convincing. It meets you where you are. It recognizes your value without needing a manual. So when you finally left, it didn't just shock him, it confused him. Because in his mind, things had always worked the way they did. He made a mistake, you forgave. He disappeared for a bit, you waited. He forgot your birthday, you understood. He crossed a line, you moved the line. Until there were no more lines left, just you drained, and him complacent. But then, you decided the story ends differently. That's what leaving really is. It's a rewrite. It's saying, I've lived this chapter too many times, and I'm ready for a different ending. And maybe he's reaching out now. Maybe he's suddenly realized everything. Maybe he's writing the messages, calling late at night, trying to piece together how you went, from always being there to being gone. But that's the thing, you didn't leave suddenly. You left over time. You left each time you were disappointed. You left each time your feelings were ignored. You left in little pieces, and the final step was just the part he noticed. Now he's realizing what you already knew, that love doesn't survive on convenience. It survives on care, on action, on consistency. You were willing to show up for love. You just needed someone who was ready to do the same. So no, he didn't believe you'd ever walk away. But not because you weren't strong. It's because he mistook your kindness for weakness, your patience for permanence, your heart for a guarantee. He thought you'd stay forever until you didn't. The moment you left, he started asking why. Suddenly, there's this panic, this realization on his part. Wait, what just happened? He's reaching out, calling, maybe even showing up, because now he's chasing closure. But here's what no one really talks about. When you're chasing peace and he's chasing closure, you're in two entirely different movies. He's trying to understand how you could walk away. But you've been trying to understand why you stayed for so long. Because, let's be honest, before you left, you were already asking questions. You were already expressing concerns. You already brought up the late replies, the emotional unavailability, the inconsistency, the way it felt like you were pouring so much into something and getting breadcrumbs in return. You didn't just walk away one day out of nowhere. You were there, trying. You were honest. You communicated. You gave the benefit of the doubt over and over again. And every time you did, you told yourself, maybe this time it'll be different. Maybe this time he'll get it. But the real tragedy is he didn't listen until the silence came, until the door actually closed. That's when it clicked. That's when the what happened questions came flooding in. The problem is the answers were already given long ago. They just weren't taken seriously. And so now he's in this space where he's scrambling for understanding, like you suddenly pulled the rug out from under him. But the truth is, this wasn't sudden. It was slow erosion. It was death by 1,000 little dismissals. It was every moment you felt unseen, every time your needs were minimized, every promise that went unkept. It built up in layers. It accumulated in your chest. And eventually, it weighed too much to carry. Now he wants to process what went wrong, and maybe part of you feels like you owe him that conversation. But let's be clear, you already had that conversation 10 times over, and you weren't heard. So now, you're not being silent out of pettiness. You're being silent because you've already spoken your truth. And in that silence, something amazing happens. You start hearing yourself more clearly. You're no longer caught in the loop of trying to decode someone else's behavior or constantly explaining your worth. That silence isn't cold. It's sacred. It's where your peace lives. And for the first time in a long time, you're protecting it. What he's calling closure is often just his discomfort with the consequences. And that's not your job to fix. Closure isn't a performance you owe to someone who didn't value your words when they were freely given. It's not your role to hold their hand through the reality of your absence. Now, some people will try to guilt you. They'll say things like, you just walked away, or you could have at least explained. And it can get in your head. It can make you question yourself. But remember, silence is rarely the first chapter in this kind of story. It's the last. It comes after everything else has been exhausted. You weren't cruel. You weren't impulsive. You simply reached the point where protecting your heart mattered more than proving your point. And don't be surprised if, now that you're gone, he starts showing you flashes of the person you were begging him to be. He may start becoming the version you always believed he could become. That's not coincidence. That's reaction. But the question isn't why now. The question is why only now? If it took your absence to awaken his effort, that tells you something. It tells you that your presence was never the issue. His complacency was. You didn't fail to show up. He failed to realize you wouldn't always be standing there waiting. And that's where you're different now. You're not standing still. You're moving forward. You're not in the loop anymore. You're not holding your breath for a version of love that only shows up when it's too late. He's chasing closure because he wants certainty. You're chasing peace because you finally accepted that uncertainty was the only thing that relationship consistently gave you. And when you've tasted peace, even just a little, you'll never trade it again for a connection that drains you. You don't need to dramatize your exit. You don't need to justify your silence. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. You didn't leave to prove a point. You didn't leave to punish him. You didn't slam the door so he'd run after you and realize how much he'd messed up. That's not why you walked away. It might have looked that way to him, like some sort of grand, dramatic exit designed to wake him up, but that wasn't. The truth is, you left because you finally woke up. You finally got tired of waiting for him to see your worth, tired of repeating the same conversation in different ways, tired of giving your love in full and getting crumbs in return. And it wasn't about being angry. That's the part people don't get. You weren't enraged or spiteful or trying to play games. You were just done. Done hoping he'd become the person you needed, done lowering your standards to maintain a relationship that was slowly chipping away at your confidence, done pretending you were okay when deep down you knew you were settling. It wasn't some sudden outburst or reaction. It was a decision, a quiet, internal decision that had been building for a long time. A moment where you looked in the mirror and said, I deserve more than this. In that moment, that wasn't about him at all. That was about you. That was the day you chose your peace over his potential. The day you stopped trying to be the exception to his patterns and started becoming the standard for your own life. And here's what's crazy. That's the moment he started to see you differently. Not when you begged him to meet you halfway. Not when you explained over and over how you felt neglected, misunderstood, unseen. Not even when you cried after another broken promise. No, the moment he finally felt your value was when you stopped trying to convince him of it. Because something shifts when you actually leave. Not threaten to leave, not emotionally disconnect while still physically staying, but really leave. And suddenly he's left with the echo of your absence. The texts don't come in anymore. The emotional support he always counted on, gone. The soft place he used to land whenever life got hard, not there. That energy you gave so freely, that warmth, that constant emotional labor, he never realized how much space you held in his world until you weren't there to hold it anymore. But here's the part that matters. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about making him suffer or hoping he regrets what he lost. If he does, fine. If he doesn't, that's fine too. Because the moment you chose yourself, his reaction stopped being the point. The real power isn't in making someone miss you. It's in no longer needing them to. You've grown past the version of you who thought love meant fixing people, healing their wounds, waiting endlessly for their potential to turn into presence. You've stopped treating relationships like rescue missions. And you've realized that staying in something that makes you feel small just to avoid being alone isn't love. It's fear dressed up as loyalty. That's not who you are anymore. You've learned that love should feel like freedom, not anxiety, like growth, not guessing games. You've stopped trying to force connection where there's inconsistency. And more than anything, you've stopped bargaining with your self-worth. Yes, he might miss you now. Yes, he might finally be seeing what he had, but that doesn't mean you need to go back. Growth doesn't mean circling back to what hurt you once it notices you're gone. Growth means moving forward with grace, knowing that the version of you who waited, pleaded, and compromised her standards, she did her best. But she's not running the show anymore. You've stepped into a new chapter now. One where love has to meet you where you are, not drag you back into where you've already healed from. One where the people in your life respect your boundaries without needing a crisis to learn them. One where you don't have to prove you're worthy of love because you already know you are. So no, you didn't leave to hurt him. You left to stop hurting yourself. And that's the most powerful decision you'll ever make.